Caddis Maximus here, this time with a utility knife and utility scraper review and comparison. I was going through my videos and I actually hadn't touched on this particular subject matter. I don't have a hugely comprehensive collection here, but it's definitely covers a pretty good variety, and I did want to mention some things about the utility scrapers. So as far as utility knives are concerned, many of, Stanley really had the market for a long time, and at least had sold a bunch of them. But I've had issues with the standard Stanleys where the blade pushes in. The Stanleys kind of look like this Klein, but this Klein actually ends up working a lot better. Now, one of the things, especially with utility knives, that becomes an issue, and it has been an issue with just the base model Stanleys, not like the nicer Stanleys such as this silver one down here, is that when you're doing any kind of operations where you're pushing really hard on the blade, it will slip and push back into the unit. And that's always been the biggest issue with utility knives. So I can certainly say that the ones that I'm reviewing here, I have not encountered that issue. You can really stand on them. And this Klein is one of those. It looks real similar to just the base model Stanleys. But this a little bit deeper cutouts on the inside means that it really has held together well. And it's always kind of nice to have a Klein utility knife. Surprisingly enough, Klein has patents on these, so I don't know if this is a remake of Stanley or maybe Stanley knocked off this one. I actually got rid of all my base model Stanleys because they were so frustrating. Some other Stanleys are better, and Stanley has such a wide variety. They have heavier duty versions such as this, which I've had much better luck with. This is an interesting type of utility knife. It's not very common, but it's a non-locking type. And you can see the switch is actually, or the thumb lever is a bit different. It's because it's just an automatic retracting. So it's kind of a safety version of a utility knife. Many situations you do need to poke through stuff, so you have to have locking styles. But there are certain situations where you're using a utility knife just to do cuts. Say, an example might be installing vapor barriers or putting up plastic when you're painting, where you don't need to push on the knife. And you don't always need the locking functionality, and you're in one of those situations where you're constantly putting it out, making a cut, and then having to retract it and put it away. That's one nice aspect about this, is because you just put it out, do your cut, and then let go. Another, it does make it quick because you can just do it and then put it back in your tool belt. If you ever drop it or something like that, what's nice is the blade automatically retracts. So it'll fall on the ground, but actually the blade won't be damaged, which is another nice aspect. And to tell you the truth, I've used this one fairly often just because it's a much heavier duty Stanley. It works well, and I really like that safety feature. So I just did want to mention that. Here's one that I've always had real good luck with. This is a Lutz 82. And these Lutz brands ones, I've always had a real nice, what should I say, experience with it. I like how the switch is a little bit more recessed than it is, say, on the Klein. The Klein really locks that well, but sometimes you can bump the switch and it will slip just because the switch is so easy to hit and depress. Or on the Lutz, it's a little bit more difficult to actually activate the switch because your finger kind of is hitting this top ledge as you're pressing it down. But the advantage of that is it's harder to accidentally hit or cause it to bump. As you can see, the Lutz does not quite have as thin a front end, and that has been an issue for me in certain situations where I need to get flat against the surface. And so ones such as the Klein have been better for me in those situations just because it has a little bit narrower of a working end. Otherwise, this Lutz, I've really had good luck with this brand. They've really proven themselves. Now, we have a newer Stanley. Stanley has, over the years, they've probably made, I swear, probably 20 or 30 different styles of utility knives. It is just crazy how many different utility knives they've made. This is a more modern version where it has the integrated cutter, and you'll notice that isn't always the standard in utility knives. Many of them, like all three of these, don't have the integrated cutter, but this one does. It has a much improved locking mechanism. I believe this is a Fat Max style, and I'm not exactly sure, but I believe it is. I believe that's what was hanging out right there. But I kind of like this one because, and many Stanleys have done this, where they just have an integrated handle where it's easy to store the blades, or an easy open where you don't have to take it apart, such as more standard utility knives, and then a quick release button here to make it easy to pop the blade in and out. And generally speaking, some of these quick releases haven't worked out so well for me, but it seems more recently, and the few models that I have here have been pretty positive. So it seems like it's kind of hit and miss, the quick release. It just depends on exactly how it's engineered. The other thing I kind of liked about this Stanley was that it had an interesting curved shape, and so that actually makes it easier to use in certain types of situations. But that generally seems to be where they're heading, is quick release for the blade and easy access in the handle. But under certain heavy-duty situations, it's really hard to beat just an all-metal, screwed-together utility knife. Now, what's been popularized, it seems, since the 2000s or so, is various flip blade versions of utility knives. It really seemed that early on, it was a style like this. This is a Husky. I don't have a blade in it, but that's what they were. They were like a folding pocket knife, but instead, they had used the trapezoidal utility knife blade, and I always kind of appreciated that and thought, that was pretty interesting. And then they just took off. It seems not just Harbor Freight, but everybody has their own little take on the design of the pocket knife style utility knife blade. The Husky is kind of interesting because the way its quick release works is it has a couple paws that grab onto the top of the blade rather than paws that come from the side of the blade. And I believe it works just fine. I think the reason they don't use this style this style quick release on as many quick release utility knives is because it may be a little bit too easy for you to bump that thumb lever and have the blade come out, but I really haven't had that much of an issue. But this is just an example, and there are many that are very similar to this, which is just an aluminum body utility knife blade, or excuse me, utility knife that uses the standard trapezoidal blades. And then it seemed that manufacturers started coming out with nicer ones, like this Milwaukee Fastback is really pretty nice. It locks in the closed position and in the open position. It uses a side-loaded quick release, which is pretty robust on the Milwaukee. It really has held together pretty well. And I like that when you can just put the blade in and just push it in and it will snap up or snap in there for a real positive engagement. It has an integrated cutter. This particular Fastback, I'm not sure what the model number is that they print on it. They didn't print on this particular one. But this one's been really, really nice for me. It has an all-aluminum body that's very rigid. It has very deep cutouts. One interesting aspect is that it not only has a cutter when you're in its open position, but when you have it closed, you have a cutter, but it's on the back side. It's a pretty wide cutter, so it's pretty easy for it to get around any kind of like plastic packing straps and that kind of thing to cut them. And I've always just liked the solidity of this unit. It really has a nice, pretty strong mechanism to hold, or I should say pin. I'm not exactly what this is called, but the anchoring system for the flip out has always been pretty good. And never had any issues with these screws coming loose. And I thought those are always kind of neat. They're not quite as handy as a regular utility knife, because a regular utility knife you just pull out and then just push the blade out. And of course, this is a little bit heavier duty, but these are kind of nicer for more utility purposes where you aren't just constantly using a utility knife and having to flip it out, make your cut, and then having to close it again. That's a little bit more inconvenient, but it's kind of nice to have it in a folding design like that. Finally, Gerber actually came out with this little unit, and I thought that was actually pretty amazing. So we have these. We can see how big the Milwaukee is compared to this unit. And we can see how much thicker it is. It's way thicker than this Gerber. And even the same thing with this more compact style Husky. This Gerber is quite a bit shorter than that unit and still quite a bit thinner. So this Gerber, I believe, is the smallest, I should say, flip blade knife that uses standard trapezoidal blades. And the whole body of this thing is actually about this, just a little bit bigger than the utility knife blade itself. They do use a screw, and you can just use a dime to loosen and tighten it. So I like that it has a positive screw engagement. And then they just have this little arm on the bottom with a little slot in it to hold the blade. So you do have to kind of be careful using it. Either hold it back here when you're doing sit and cutting operations, or you can hold it up here when you need to do press and do kind of straight cuts, but you just have to be careful because this kind of utility knife is just a little bit more dangerous because it's easy for your hands to slip and, of course, give yourself a bad cut. But what's handy about it is it is a liner lock, but that it is just so darn small and so darn thin. I would think that if I'm in a position where I'm using a utility knife, I either just need a full-size heavy-duty one because I'm just using it constantly, or if I'm going to have one that I kind of carry around and use occasionally, even though I like these heavier duty ones, there's something to be said about something that's really small, lightweight, and compact like this Gerber. This could be used as just a regular pocket knife. Of course, you're not going to have the strongest blade in there because it's a utility knife blade. But the one advantage is that if the blade ever dulls, you can always replace it with a brand new, super razor sharp blade. And that's what I kind of liked about it. And so I wanted to point out that they do make standard utility or knives that take standard utility blades that are just pretty darn compact. We of course have this style, which is the breakaway blade. So the idea behind these is you would use them. What's nice is that you can have a really long blade if you need a long blade. But if you end up dinging the edge, that you just put these out, and then they always have a little lock clamp, which I kind of like. And then you snap off the end of the blade that's damaged, and then you'll continue to have new pieces. Most of these actually have a carriage, a stack of 5 of those blades. So when they actually run out, you would actually run this all the way up until this little clip lifts up, and then you can just pull out the old stub of the blade, or even a whole blade if you've damaged it, and then you just run this back and it'll just pick up another blade from the carriage. Once those all run out, you actually can buy packs of replacement blades, and these back handles will pop off. They're kind of stiff on these Master Mechanics, but you can pop them off and insert a new 5-blade pack and then just start working again. Out of all these, I found a lot of them are pretty cheesy, fairly poorly made, a lot of plastic. And then these, surprisingly enough, these Master Mechanics, I'm not sure who makes them, but they're a steel liner with an all aluminum body. They're actually pretty rigid and pretty heavy duty. And the few Master Mechanic products, these are actually not bad at all. They also make a compact version, which just uses the thinner blades. And it's the exact same way, where they have an aluminum body. Now, the way these mechanisms work, you can see that the switch kind of rides back and forth. So it has a type of internal lock. So once you've set the position, it will lock in the little teeth that's in these. However, I do like that they have a clamp, and it seems to be standard on any nice one, where they'll have a clamp just to give you extra holding force and rigidity at the working end of the tool. And then, of course, here's a Stanley version, which just has a rubberized grip. It's a plastic body, so even a nicer Stanley, and this is a pretty heavy-duty body, is still just a plastic body. So that's why I thought the Master Mechanics were nice, just because they had an aluminum body and it makes for a more rigid tool. I have this little Cobalt just to show people that there actually is little utility knives that take trapezoidal blades. This is the only one that I have. It's a little quick release, but yes, they make little tiny trapezoidal blades for utility knives. Let me put this back in here. And I just wanted to point that out. This is a weird little Cobalt tool. I just saw that it had the little trapezoidal blade. Finally, to finish up, we're going to talk about various knives and scrapers. Now, these don't use trapezoidal. These use the other type, I would say, of utility blade, which is the square blade with the reinforced back. This is kind of an interesting little tool because it uses that, but it uses those type of blades, but it's at an angle. And so you wouldn't really use this for too many cutting operations because, or slicing, because of you would use a utility knife. But for scraping, this is kind of handy because it changes the angle where you can get into some pretty tight spaces. I've actually found myself using this quite a few times in automotive applications, just because it's a little easier to get it flat on the surface and get it into compact and tight areas. So I just wanted to show, it's pretty rare to see ones that are basically at a 90-degree angle. This is about an 80-degree angle or so. We have our traditional box cutters. These are like the most common tool to see one of those blades in. And I just wanted to compare. We have a few different ones, a Pacific Handy Cutter, a Great Neck. We have an old Red Devil here, and then we have a Jiffy Cutter. I'm not exactly sure who really originated these box cutters, but it's surprising the different designs. Like the Red Devil and the Pacific are aluminum housing with the steel insert. It's all steel in the Jiffy Cutter. However, I will mention I've had quite a few Jiffy Cutters, and they're seem to be really poorly manufactured. Many times there's either a big gap when they've rolled this outer shell over, or that's been too long and then it's like all offset. I've really had a hit and miss time with them. Otherwise, these are nice for opening packaging because they're pretty safe. They only have a little bit of an exposed blade, and then you just push them in to close them up. I will say that the Red Devil, you can see the little crystalline structure, so they use galvanized metal in theirs. So the Red Devil's pretty nice, but I just wanted to compare. It's surprising that even something like a box cutter, that there's just so many different brands and just slightly different styles, whether they're have bumps on the end or a little slot and a bump in the middle to get them to stop. And just thought that was curious. So the last thing we're going to look at here is these types of utility scrapers, like these hides. Now these are the scrapers that most people are familiar with. And I have a few different styles here. All three of these first ones actually aren't knockoffs of each other. They're various grade hides. And I believe that this one, the stainless steel one, is the newest style of them, and that's what they've gone for, is a nice high-grade stainless steel, although I'm not positive about that. But they started out as these with kind of with kind of a smooth button that wasn't very easy to manage, and the stamping just wasn't very defined on them. This really is a hide, but it's just the stamping was so light. I mean, it's almost impossible. You can kind of see the registered trademark right there, like they are on these. But it was really surprising. The rivets on this, you can see, barely are holding it together. It was kind of surprising. This just wasn't a very good unit. The stamping is kind of poor, so it does generally stay open, but it just hasn't worked great. And then it seems that they went with a newer version, which is a little higher quality metal. They changed the button to have more aggressive texturing on it. And the center portion, the stamping is just a little deeper, so it has a more definitive lock. And you can really hear that. It really snaps in there much better. And of course, higher quality stamping. And then of course, I did forget to mention that the hide does do spot welds right at the opening to prevent it from splitting, which I like. It makes it a little bit heavier duty. And then it seems that they went even further. And that's why I think this is the newer one, although I'm not entirely positive, but it seems obvious that they went with stainless steel. The rivets are much deeper and have a lot more overlap, so they hold the unit together much better. The spot welds, if we can get this to focus, are about twice the size as they were on the older units, which is another upgrade. And then we can see on the stamping here that it's really defined, really deep. The little protrusion here is really well defined, and it's really surprising. This one has worked out super well for me, and I believe these are the newest ones, and I thought, wow, this has got to be one of the best. If it's stainless steel and then they have such high quality stamping, it's a welcome upgrade. We do have some other styles here, however, and I did want to point those out. We have an old accuracy Warner, which is kind of the more traditional style. They spot welded instead of using rivets, and they don't have any kind of reinforcing on the front, although they do have a pretty thick body. But that's just one of the other styles, and these work generally okay, although there's been some issues I've had with other ones with it slips. These aren't as easy to use and open and close as the hides. We have a Red Devil here, which is basically the very same thing as that Accuracy Warner, but the Red Devil, I'd say, is probably one of the cheapest ones. It's really kind of a thin body, no reinforcing spot welds, and then just some basic rivets to hold it together. But did have it as part of the collection. And then, of course, on this last one here, we have an old Alway here. And the Alway is kind of interesting because it uses brass-plated internals with a real aggressive button. So this is kind of a combination of the hide style switch with the proprietary locking mechanism, which seems like it's worked out pretty well. What I liked about this one, it was really kind of compact. It's all spot welded, but they did use microscopic spot welds, but they did double weld right at the front end, so that helps prevent it from coming apart. And it's just a bit more compact, although I don't use it very much because I've still found that the hides, just that long shape and this kind of curved handle with the notches really seems to be one of the best ergonomics that you can have for one of these utility scrapers. So anyway, I had a few of these utility knives and scrapers and thought I'd put together a video so we could compare different styles and different aspects, and now you know a little bit what to look for, particularly with the scrapers, making sure that they have good reinforcing on the front end and that they have a pretty good build quality. Because it's real unfortunate. A lot of these cheaper utility scrapers, you know, you get in one tough situation, the whole body will just split apart on you. Or the locking mechanism, as soon as you start, you know, doing a tough scrape, the blade will push back in because of a poor quality locking mechanism. So anyway, I think that just about finishes it up for this utility knife review and comparison. I really appreciate everybody watching, and please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.